Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Katerina Bonder. I'm Associate Fellow here with CSIS, and we have a great panel of distinguished panelists and speakers who I probably will introduce a bit later. Let me just share with you first who I am and why this panel is extremely important for me, because I'm coming from Ukraine, and panel on Ukraine is a very actual and relevant topic right now. So I've been working for the Ukrainian government for the past 10 years, and I was responsible for financial cooperation and economic growth in Ukraine. And when the war has started, I moved, like many Ukrainians, to Europe, and probably I would like to start with saying thank you for our European countries and European partners for the great support that they provided to Ukrainian people and Ukraine as a country with this enormous war. I just, I had some personal experience how this was happening in Poland, in Krakow. People were coming just to the train station to open their homes and houses to welcome Ukrainian refugees, and it was across Europe, and it was enormous. So thank you so much for your support, and thank you so much for your help. And now let me introduce our speakers and our panelists. So we have Colin Buckley here. Colin is a Managing Director and General Counsel at British International Investment. Stella Leuca is a former State Secretary for European Integration at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Moldova. We have Maria Haakensen, who is the CEO of Swedfund, and we have Ambassador Marek Magierowski, who is an ambassador of the Republic of Poland to the United States. Welcome. So probably let's start with a couple of numbers which I consider really important for us to hear. So according to estimates of the Ministry of Economic Development of Ukraine, 4.6 million people from Ukraine moved to Europe. According to estimates of the United Nations, this number is 6.2 million people. And this is Ukrainian human capital. This is the most economically active population which left Ukraine, and it poses a lot of questions about future economic growth of Ukraine, and this is a huge issue for Ukrainian government right now. On the other hand, we have another number, which is $486 billion. This is the number, this is the estimate of the damage of Ukraine and losses that Ukraine have at the current stage, and I assume that this number is already bigger. So this is the amount of money and resources that we need to leverage and that we need to attract to rebuild Ukraine at current stage. So let's look at these two big trends. First of all, Ukraine has lost a lot of its basis for economic growth, which is human capital, because people build companies, people make economy grow, and Ukraine lost its children, who are the future of Ukrainian economically active population, and now they're getting assimilated in Europe. So the current situation is pretty bad, but we're looking forward and trying to predict what's going to happen in the future when majority of kids moved abroad. And on the other hand, we have an enormous request for resources to build Ukraine today and in future. So let's probably start our conversation with thinking of about these two parallel trends that we have right now. And probably I would ask you to start with your thoughts. I wouldn't say this opening remarks, it's too official, just your thoughts on how this influx of Ukrainian refugees and Ukrainian human capital contributed and impacted your countries, the economies of your countries. And both in positive and probably negative ways. Let's start from this. And probably we can start with Stella, who represents Moldova, and the ambassador who represents Poland as the most closest to Ukraine countries who had the biggest influx.
No, Indeed, and thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here today. At the moment when Russia started its war of aggression against Ukraine, I was in Moldova with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and part of my responsibility was to work also on the security aspects of things. And I remember waking up hearing the bombings from the capital, city capital of Moldova in Chisinau. It's that close. I mean, you can literally cross our country in about 3.5 hours by car, and we're about less than 2 hours away from Ukraine, where the initial bombing was also happening. That immediately triggered a massive inflow of refugees running away from the war. And let's remember that it was freezing. It was February. And our lines in the south near the Odessa area were over 15 kilometers. That is over 10 miles of lines of people outside of the cars. The car lines were separate. Those were just people standing. And it was women with children and pets. That was the beginning of the war when it comes to the flow of the people outflow of the people from Ukraine. Over the time, Moldova has had about 1.2 million people from Ukraine cross the Republic of Moldova. Many of them staying for an initial refuge in Moldova, and then trying to figure out what is next for them. They were trying to make those very hard decisions, whether they were staying or they will be going further. Are they going further to Europe? Those who have stayed, it's about 100,000 people, and that percentually, it's about 5% of Moldova's population. Those who have stayed, they mainly chose to do so because if you look at the social, economic elements of their decision, they were mainly on the elderly side, maybe thinking or rationalizing whether there's more or enough opportunities for them to integrate and to find good opportunities further in the EU, and then they did choose to stay. About 10% of the children in the Republic of Moldova were made up of Ukrainian children at some point. And why I'm bringing these numbers, it's not as impressive maybe in terms of the numbers, but in terms of the per capita number of refugees, Moldova has had the highest number of refugees. That's one. And then these two elements that have put a lot of pressure on our social infrastructure, if I may call it that way. That the people who chose to stay in Moldova were also people who were hoping that the war will end very soon, and they wanted to go home. They wanted to be close to their home, and they wanted to return. But that has, most of the times, have caused them not to necessarily apply for formal refugee status. And that in itself, that made it much more difficult for both the Moldovan government, but also the international development agencies to provide support to the Ukrainian refugees hosted in Moldova. We were initially having issues with integrating the kids into kindergarten schools. We don't have the schools in Ukrainian. We have 2 schools in the entire country in Ukrainian because we do have a minority. But to be honest, their curricula weren't very well taught or very well developed. So that was the initial struggles that we had both in Moldova, but also the Ukrainians coming over and looking for refuge. Personally, my mom is also from Ukraine, so I still have family that is there. My cousins are there. My uncles are there. So it's even more of an emotional affair for me as well. However, we've done a few things throughout the years, but I think really throughout the 2 years, but I think really what is important to understand is that one cannot do it by themselves. And especially for us, we are still, somewhere there among the most poor in Europe, poor countries in Europe, as I mentioned, with limited social infrastructure. But this is just about the people, and I'm assuming we will be speaking a little bit later about the economic implications and the infrastructure implications, but this is all building together. What we have found that has worked throughout the years is working with our social protection and social integration agencies, including the ministries, and the health aspect of things and the education aspect of things, and trying to find opportunities for Ukrainians who are deciding to stay in Moldova, find opportunities for them to fully integrate. We have restaurants that currently have Ukrainian staff, like 90% Ukrainian staff. And although they do speak, ironically, the language of the aggressor, because it is the language that we share together and we both nations understand, people actually speak the language and don't refuse to do it, because we understand why that is the case. We have built opportunities to have kindergarten services in Ukrainian, the same for education. There are beauty salons, and all of this is that we seek them, veterinarians, and we seek them as Ukrainian provided or services provided by Ukrainian refugees. And at the same time, I think it's a combination of one, government stepping up and making sure that you can still provide a work permit even though they don't have refugee status, and making sure that Ukrainian refugees can still access medicine services free of charge, even though they don't yet have formally refugee status, but at the same time is also working with the people on the other side of things, working with the citizens of Moldova to make sure that the disinformation that we are getting from Russia of what's going on in Ukraine, making sure that those things do not affect the way we operate, and rather than distance us away from Ukraine, we actually embrace and help each other out.
This is amazing. Thank you so much. Marek, maybe you can share a bit more on economic impact of Ukrainians arriving to Poland.
First of all, my wholehearted gratitude for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me. I think very few people, especially here in America, realize how integrated Poland's and Ukraine's economies are. They were, even before the war. We had about 1.5 million economic migrants from Ukraine who had lived and worked in our country before the Russian aggression against Ukraine in February 22. I will give you just one specific example to what extent Poland's economy is sensitive in this respect. After the outbreak of the war, thousands of young Ukrainians were mobilized into the army, and many of them had worked in the construction sector in Poland. So they had to return to Ukraine, leaving a yawning void in the Polish economy we had to grapple with. Approximately 1.5 million refugees arrived in Poland after the Russian invasion, so Poland's population increased abruptly by about 3 million people, from roughly 38 to 41, which was unprecedented. Before World War II, Poland's society was much more diverse than it is today, so it is a new phenomenon for us, but I think we did our utmost to help those Ukrainians integrate into the Polish society, and they do integrate smoothly and steadily. Also because most of those refugees are women and children, because we all know what the Ukrainian men are doing today, over 90%. And those women never say, we want the Polish authorities to take care of our families. They never say we want welfare. They say we want a job. And we offer them jobs also because our unemployment rate in Poland is ridiculously low, around 3%. So we can even physically absorb subsequent waves of economic migrants or refugees arriving in Poland from Ukraine. What is also crucial is that the perception the Ukrainians have of Poland as an EU member. Because there is a distinct difference between the economic systems in Poland as a member of the European Union, and Ukraine, which has only submitted its application just recently. So many of those people who now live in Poland see the difference between the political and economic systems in Poland and in Ukraine, and that somehow strengthens and bolsters their pro-European aspirations, which is also important for us. So that integration is progressing in a very interesting manner. So many similarities between our nations. We do consider Ukraine a European country, and that's why it's one of the reasons we support Ukraine's ambitions. It's not only about the language. Kids who now live in Poland, they learn Polish in a matter of months. It's also the cultural background. And last but not least, when we recall that extraordinary outburst of solidarity and sympathy towards our Ukrainian neighbors or brethren just after the outbreak of the war, we have to remember that we share the same enemy. We were oppressed and subjugated and invaded by the Tsarist Empire, by Bolshevik Russia, and then by the Soviet Union for centuries. And that's why Poles remembered very well why we felt obliged to help our Ukrainian friends. And on the final note, this is an argument I've been using abundantly here in my conversations with my American friends and interlocutors. We are arming ourselves, as you know. We are spending a lot of money on defense. We have increased our military expenditures up to 4% of our GDP, which is the double of the NATO benchmark. Not because we don't believe in the sacrosanct character of the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, but because we want other countries to follow in our footsteps. And we also do not want to see a new Bucha or Irpin or Mariupol, this time on the outskirts of Warsaw. So knowing Central Europe's history and knowing all the meanders, if you will, of our relations with Russia, it was a very natural reaction of the Polish society to reach out to the Ukrainians and to help them not only flee the ravages of war in Ukraine, but also integrate in a smooth fashion into the Polish society.
Amazing, thank you. Yes, Poland was one of our biggest friends in the European community, but yesterday I was talking to the Ministry of Finance and my good friend, the Minister of Finance of Ukraine. He is here for the spring meetings, and he shared with me that Sweden is one of our biggest friends in terms of funding and financial promotion and filling our budgeting gaps. And Sweden does really good job, a lot of work, and it's not that public and well known, so probably Maria, you can share a bit more, like what tools and instruments do you have to help us financially?
Thank you so much. And from a Swedish perspective, I mean, we have not had the same influx of Ukrainian refugees. We have had some, and I can really appreciate, I mean, the outflow of the human capital of Ukraine and what that really does. But I think from a Swedish perspective, I mean, it's been much more to really be determined in that we are very firm in our support for Ukraine. And it is in all parts of the Swedish budget, but if you just look on development aid and development finance, Ukraine is now the most prioritized and also biggest country actually of the Swedish development aid budget. So I'm the CEO of Swedfund, which is the Swedish Development Finance Institution, and our mission is really to work with sustainable investments in developing countries. To do what? Well, to create jobs. So it very much ties into what you have said, and that is really an important part, to create resilience in the economy. We also see that through our investments we can increase, for example, export revenues. Last year we invested in something called Horizon Capital, which targets then small IT companies. They are really important. We see a huge opportunity in Ukraine, coming back to the importance of the human capital. There is a high competence in Ukraine in that sector. So if we can support that, give access to capital to small and mid-sized enterprises, well then they can employ more, and they also generate really important export revenues. From our perspective, it's also so that, I mean, we invested in Ukraine already before the war, and we also invest in Georgia and Moldova. So for us, this is also an important geographical priority, the whole neighboring region, for the same reason. We can come back and talk later on what we do in infrastructure as well, which is, of course, also an important part. But just to give one example then to confirm what you said, that the Swedish government actually earlier this week took a decision on an increased dedicated capital injection for Swedfund earmarked for Ukraine, really saying that we would like you to do more investments in Ukraine and really step forward and take the risk. So we will really accelerate and try to do more investments both in infrastructure but also, of course, focusing on job creation in different sectors like the food sector or the IT sector.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Colin, I know you were deeply involved into organizing Ukrainian Recovery Conference last year in London. Besides that, United Kingdom is also a very active supporter of Ukrainian agenda to keep it on top of the news, and like the first champion in signing security agreements, etc. So probably you could share with us your experience on how to unite international community around the topic of Ukrainian recovery, first of all. Second, could you please give us a bit more details about donor coordination, because this is where we have and fill some gaps and areas for improvement, let's say. And what is your sense of British priorities in terms of recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, first of all, let me say I'm just completely honored to be sharing a stage with such prominent friends of Ukraine, and the UK is honored and happy to be counted amongst that number. I mean, this is a great topic, and it's a great topic because it accepts the inevitability of economic alignment of Ukraine with the West. And I mean, these are difficult days, darkened by news from the battlefront and poisoned by propaganda that circulates suggesting that the West is not aligned with Ukraine. So really, there is no better time to talk about how to fully integrate Ukraine into the European market or into the global market. So, I mean, first of all, I think it's obvious to all that EU accession is both the path and the reward for integration. But that is a long journey. And I think what we are working on right now is thinking about how we integrate along that journey. What are some of the steps? So I thought that it might be useful to sort of distill all of this, partly what we talked about at the conference last summer and what we may talk about in Berlin, sort of some of what donors are talking about and some of the challenges. And I'll go a step further and actually make some perhaps provocative suggestions of necessary decisions in order to better integrate Ukraine. I mean, first of all, the challenge is a big challenge. I mean, Ukraine was engaged in deindustrialization even before the time of the war, and the war has set back, industry quite a bit. Ukrainian business is probably the most energy dependent of any country in Europe, and it's not entirely productive. But I mean, I think we just have to accept all of that and sort of move on to, okay, well how do we integrate even given that? And so I'm going to give sort of 7 points. And the first one is money. Because at the end of the day, it's all about money. How do we get money? So I think we should do, obviously, everything we can to mobilize foreign investment into Ukraine. But I believe there's a little bit too much focus on foreign investment as the cavalry that will ride to the rescue of Ukraine. I think FDI will take a very long time. So I think that instead of that, perhaps we should be focusing on Ukrainian investment. And rather than talking about using concession to mobilize Western private equity funds into Ukraine, we should think about how we can use subsidies for Ukrainian businesses to help them begin to invest in their own country, begin to invest in their own businesses. Second point under money is we have to unlock the excess liquidity in Ukrainian banks. So that means some Ukrainian regulatory reform, perhaps coupled with EBRD doing direct lending through the banks. There's a lot of money in the banks. They're not lending in Ukraine. Surely we should come up with a way to promote that. The second point I would make is that we have to focus on the most productive sectors. I made this point, I think, earlier this week downstairs when we were talking about CSIS. I mean, the bill for reconstruction is higher than the money available. And that means priorities and choices have to be made. And the choices have to be focusing investment in the most productive sectors, even if that means that in the short term we have to absorb, or Ukraine has to absorb, social pain by, for example, not prioritizing housing, or the West has to accept that notions like green investment and clean energy potentially have to be put off for a while. We have to focus on productivity. The third point is we have to look for quick wins. The brass ring of EU accession is too distant. We need to show integration, every month, every 3 months, every 6 months. We have to show Ukraine becoming closer and closer aligned with Europe. So, I mean, one quick win would be Ukraine has a deep need for certification labs in order to certify goods in order to trade with the EU. So we should fund those with grants immediately, create these laboratories so that Ukrainian goods can be certified. That's something we can do quickly, we can resolve quickly. That's a quick win. And it's all about EU, it's all about integration. The fourth point is we have to promote Ukrainian-sourced goods. We have to promote them internationally. That means that governments like the UK government should champion nearshoring, should champion putting Ukrainian goods into the supply chain of our manufacturing. But also domestically, the Ukrainian government has to continue to favor Ukrainian goods in its own procurement. And I think, the story about this dramatic increase in Ukrainian-built drones, which has been presented as a military story, actually has some economic lessons to be learned there as well. This is a story about procurement, and Ukrainian businesses very rapidly answering a need. We should never underestimate exactly how nimble Ukrainian entrepreneurs can be. The fifth point I would make is to provide skills transfer. And there's always been a lot of talk about the Marshall Plan. Whenever we talk about Ukraine, we talk about the Marshall Plan. And most people talk about the Marshall Plan as kind of the transfer of large amounts of money from the West to European countries. But there is an often forgotten part of the Marshall Plan, which was the Productivity Assistance Program. The Productivity Assistance Program basically took European factory managers and engineers and sent them to the United States to learn modern productivity techniques. They were sent back to Europe. This was phenomenally successful. You saw improvements of productivity of 25 to 50% without any addition of fixed assets whatsoever. I mean, the EU is famous for having very advanced standards in how they run business and in engineering. And I would look to duplicate that by trying to increase the productivity of Ukrainian businesses by simply doing a skills transfer. And the last point I would make is perhaps, the sixth point, sorry, I have 7. The sixth point is a provocative one, which is we have to hold our nose around Ukrainian oligarchs. I mean, look, it's very clear that we should not invest in any business that would involve a Russian-sanctioned individual, but I'm very worried that concern around Ukrainian oligarchs is freezing investment into Ukraine. I think the path to Ukrainian reconstruction involves all parts of the Ukrainian economy, and we just have to face the facts that that includes Ukrainian oligarchs. And we have to leave it to the Ukrainian government to come up with a political solution over time in how we address that. And for economists in the room, I think Stefan Durkin's book called Gambling on Development is perhaps the best argument for why you have to deal with entrenched elites in a country in order to make a fundamental shift in economic growth. And then my final point is, I think we have to permit Ukraine some industrial policy. And the minister, the ambassador from Poland, will know better than I some of the arguments that we're already hearing about, protectionism and about political goods, especially agricultural goods coming into Europe. But I think we have to permit Ukraine to provide some state aid. We have to permit them to have some protectionist policies in the short term in order to speed economic reconstruction. Without any question, come EU accession, they will have to completely align with competition. But in the short term, I think we have to let Ukraine set some industrial policy. So those are seven kind of points, kind of distilled from conversations about how integration might work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this comprehensive plan.
It's not comprehensive, it's only 7.
It's only 7, we can expand. And probably I would like to expand a couple of points that you mentioned about industrial policy and oligarchs' involvement, because we all know that in Ukraine, big industry, and especially heavy industry, is very interconnected with oligarchs, although now they're losing some assets, etc. But it's a big chunk of economy, which also requires a lot of resources and funds for reconstruction and recovery. I'm curious to hear your opinion about investment into those sectors, like this balance of interests. On the one hand, we should restore Ukrainian industry. On the other hand, a lot of it is related and connected with oligarchs. And what is your opinion how this investment should be structured in these sectors?
I mean, it's difficult to give you a direct
It's
question
the eighth
on that.
point.
I'm sorry.
The eighth point.
As I said, we'll expand.
Yeah, the 8th point. Look, I mean, it's difficult to give you a direct answer. I mean, there's much to unpack there. I mean, there is a genuine question about whether we should rebuild or whether we should build back better. I mean, rebuilding is cheaper. Building back better leads to more productivity. That's a difficult choice. There is a choice about whether you engage with, businesses that are established in Ukraine. That gives you a platform, but the only established businesses in Ukraine at any scale, especially in these sectors, involve Ukrainian oligarchs. And so you have to make that decision. And then the final question is the point that I made, which is you have to prioritize the most productive sectors. I mean, and there are parts of industry that are highly productive. There are traditional parts of history in Ukraine that I would say are extremely non-productive. Now, the state has sometimes favored non-productive industry for a variety of reasons. So that is a difficult political choice. I think I just dodged your question, but I've tried to explain why. So.
If I may, in a broader context, Poland, since the transformation in 1989, and especially since we joined the European Union in 2004, we have acquired exceptional expertise in terms of how to integrate our economy into the European Union structure, with all the directives and regulations and a very difficult architecture within the framework of the European Union, which is very difficult to navigate, as you all know. And we are trying to share this knowledge with our Ukrainian friends, organizing, for example, courses and training for Ukrainian public servants, even at the peak of the war, because we do consider it extremely important to have all those Ukrainian public servants and officials well prepared for this eventuality, which will materialize one day, of Ukraine joining the European Union. And they can learn from our mistakes and from our accomplishments in this particular period. Also because what we share is that post-communist legacy, which we've had to cope with since 1989, how to crack down on corruption, how to improve the functioning of the administration. This is, Poland has not been, fail-proof and perfect, adapting to new political and economic circumstances, again, since we acceded to the European Union. Still, I think even the sizes of our respective countries are similar, and the population. So, based on so many similarities, I think that this is also our task and our duty to help Ukrainians adapt faster and in a more efficient way to this new world they are going to join one day in the future.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this. And being very deeply involved into Ukrainian reforms and working with the Ukrainian government for quite a long time, I know that Ukraine, unfortunately, has this approach that, we will take the best practice, copy-paste it, and it might work, which usually doesn't work. So in terms of European integration, like most of your countries went through this process. Stella, you were responsible specifically for European integration. What is your vision and what kind of advice could you give to Ukraine, what it should focus on and how it should adapt in current situation and circumstances, its integration process, which is ongoing?
I think you're asking me to dodge a question too. But I think it's very, out of the many points that you have highlighted, I'm glad you actually structured it that way. I think those are all extremely valid points. And really, one of the big questions that needs to be discussed in this type of development fora or helping Ukraine recover fora is rebuild or build back better. Because that's really going to take very different approaches, it's going to take different times, and there's different elements that come into play, including the neighboring states, including the efforts that go towards European integration as well. I mean, if you ask me, sure, I would go for build back better. But we also acknowledge that they may cost much more than the 500 billion that we are currently estimating at. It may take much more than the 12, 15 years that we're currently estimating at. Is Ukraine as a country, are Ukrainians as citizens, are they willing to take that much time and undergo all these efforts and just the struggles of how long it will take to build back better? And then, for sure, that will also involve a switch, I guess, in the traditional industries, as you also rightly pointed. I mean, we've all heard the grains export stories. We all know about the transit of gas from Russia all the way to Europe. All the energy production, you also pointed that out. I mean, which are the routes? How is that affecting the livelihoods of everyday Ukrainians as opposed to the longer term development of the country, and then in alignment with the European standards? I mean, I don't know if we're all really familiar or aware, but the package of regulations of joining, for us to be able to join the EU as countries, it doesn't matter if it's us as 2 million people or Ukraine as 40, it's about 27,000 pieces of different rules and regulations that we need to review and make sure that we're either in compliance or figure out how to comply with. So that's the actual effort to take. And then you need to also do it. So acknowledging all this, I personally think we're going to have to figure out ways to somehow have a combination of this is the long-term vision, this is the ideal situation, we need quick fixes, but also quick wins to keep the Ukrainian nation still positive and finishing and winning this war, and then also keep on building themselves, rebuilding themselves. So there's that part of things. I think it's also important for us to acknowledge the importance of what goes on also around Ukraine. And Poland is a big country. You guys are members of the European Union. It's a different kind of functionality there. Moldova is not. We are 2 million people compared to the 40 million of Ukraine, but also we are very much subject to still the disinformation and propaganda that comes from Russia as well. So a little tiny piece of land in between Europe, which is also Schengen area now with Romania having joined, and then Ukraine that is getting all the support and the attention and the reconstruction as it should. Moldova needs to also figure out ways of how to get involved and to prevent any kind of element of instability for the region. So upskilling, for example, I think that's an amazing opportunity for both us as a small country, but also Ukraine to rethink how we do things, to grow and develop, looking at new jobs. I mean, like you said, the drone production thing, it's fascinating, you know, it happened, in the last 2 years. So that type of things is going to change how we function as an economy. Maybe one day Ukraine will no longer be reliant so much on the export of grains, but rather go into more technology-based, but also industrial production. So looking at all those things is extremely important. I also have a very extensive background in development. So I actually am glad that you brought up the donor coordination. And it's not just the donor coordination. I think donors are they really absolutely must work together with the private sector on this, because you don't have space and time and money for overlap and conducting different policies that contradict themselves and pull in different directions. I think that is going to be really, really important. And yes, the efforts for EU accession are going to streamline the legislative portion, the regulatory portion of things to some degree. But in the meantime, there needs to be continuous effort to coordinate and work together. We in Moldova have already been looking at how can we use our existing infrastructure to support the recovery and the reconstruction in the south of Ukraine. Just to give you a very brief example, we have a small portion of land, which is 7 kilometers. It's less than 4.5 miles. And that's where trucks from Ukraine come and go through Moldova to be able to cross into Romania. It's 7 kilometers. And that we've expanded the border crossing, we've reutilized the border crossing points, we've done all that work. But because the roads are so narrow and so small and so, how should I say, dilapidated, destroyed, not in a good situation, when trucks are crossing, you can't have anything else cross. So you need to make choices. Who is going? Is it going to be the Ukrainian trucks, or is it going to be the Moldovan people that are going that same route? So that type of things, that needs to be very closely interconnected. And this is just one of the examples that there are multiples of this. And one cannot do that just by foreign direct investment or by development efforts. There's need for very, very well thought through approaches to address this type of issues.
Thank you, Stella. Maria, would you like to?
I think a lot has been said, and I think I like what your comment on also, especially the quick wins, and that also there needs to be a hope. And I think also coming back to where we started with the human capital, I think that is extremely important to have that aspect and to really see. Then I think it's a trade-off between the build back better and to do it now. And maybe it's not, you can make different choices also for different sectors. I think here, I mean, it also has to be Ukraine who is in the lead and say this is what we believe, and I think that is an essential part of all of this. And with respect for that, and also saying that they have so many things that they need to handle and deal with in this situation. And I think there's a big obligation also on all of us on the side who wants to support and help. How can we do that in a way that also makes it easier for them, and how can we coordinate ourselves? I think that's also maybe a very important aspect, whether it's donor coordination or whether it's development, finance, investments, or whatever it is, that how can we support and make sure that it's easier on that side. So I think it's a tricky one. Then I think when we talked about the Swedish firm support Ukraine, I think one of the important things is just what you said also around the importance of trade, that we want to have an increased trade with Ukrainian companies. So we believe quite a lot in if we invest in the private sector, there will be more companies that we would be able to trade with. So that's actually also a very clear part of when the Swedish minister talks about our support to Ukraine, that is also what Sweden is after, an increased trade. And I think that is a very important narrative to keep as well.
Okay.
My final point, because I will have to excuse myself, I have to join my finance minister for his next engagement. One topic we have not touched upon yet, energy security. I think Ukraine, especially in this respect, is still too reliant on Russia. This is an ongoing process, of course, and Ukrainian government is trying to decouple Ukraine from this particular dependence. Poland has always been prescient. I'm not saying that we've always been right, but we have always been prescient about the necessity of strengthening our defenses in this particular sphere. And that's why we have been struggling for so many years to render our country entirely independent of imports of Russian gas. And we have been entirely independent for 2 years. We chose not to renew the long-term contract with Gazprom. Now we are transferring gas from the Norwegian continental shelf via Denmark to the Polish stretch of the Baltic coast. And I think that in many other countries, I'm a diplomat, so I'm not going to name names, but in many other countries in Europe, that conviction was not that clear as it used to be in Poland. Fortunately, many of our partners in the European Union followed suit, and now we have collectively reduced our dependence on imports of Russian raw materials tremendously. And I think that we should not forget this important pillar of our overall security, and we have to look at Ukraine also through this lens.
No, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador.
If I may actually add to the energy element, I think it's extremely important that you point out. Right before the war started, Moldova has gone through also crazy interactions with Gazprom and extension or non-extension of the contracts and cutting down supply, even though contracts were extended and prices were increased. Our prices for gas imports from Russia have increased 700%. 700%. That is just unheard of, much more than those countries that you wouldn't name and I wouldn't name as well. But the whole idea is that, as you mentioned, this rethinking of the energy needs to happen. When Russia was bombing Ukrainian infrastructure in Ukraine, we had blackouts in Moldova as well, because that's how it was built. It's legacy energy infrastructure that relied on cheap Russian gas at that point. So we need to rethink. And that falls also into that category, rebuild or build back better. I think we are in a situation where we do need, this is one of the sectors where we must explore other opportunities, especially like more sustainable, renewable, all kinds of other options that rather come from the West, if I may say so, and rather than the East. But interconnectivity with the European Union network, that has pretty much saved us all during the initial times. And like you mentioned as well, we have also managed to, for a short period of time, to be honest, but we have managed to be zero reliant on Russian gas. And that was huge for Moldova because we were over 90% 80% reliant on Russian gas. So seeing that it can be done, that is amazing, but we cannot do it other than together. Either Ukraine or Moldova, we are a small portion, but all the roads cross back and forth through us as well. So we need to really keep that in mind when rebuilding and rethinking.
Thank you, Ambassador, for joining our panel. Yes, energy sector is like the most obvious sector which suffered from this war, and one of the most obvious. And I just heard recently that Moldova launched energy sandboxes. It's like the new environment where innovators can experiment with new energy solutions. So maybe you can share and tell us about other sectors which were impacted in your countries by this war. I mean, not directly, but politicians looked at some restructuring or maybe applying some lessons learned from Ukrainian experience, because Ukraine is thinking now how to rebuild its electric grid, make it autonomous, like, really small, not decentralized big plants, power plants. Maybe there are other examples just on top of your mind that you can name that your countries are looking at.
I think one interesting thing is the Ukrainian banking system, that you can actually see that it has worked very, very well during this whole situation. And I think from an outside perspective, I think there's many countries who are interested in understanding, how have they done it? So it's actually from a reverse discussions in the what can you learn from the Ukrainian situation. I think that's one aspect. Then I think, of course, if you look on communication and the digital infrastructure, I think that's also an important one. Before I joined Swedfund, I worked for many years in Ericsson, and I've also had the pleasure to actually work with mobile networks in Ukraine and in Kiev. We talked about that before. And I think it's also interesting to look at that sector and the stability and the performance of the mobile networks and how they were able to actually find a way to keep that going. That has been instrumental. So I think there are also good examples to highlight from that. Then, of course, we talk about influence and disinformation and so on. And of course, cybersecurity is very closely related to this. And I think also the importance of Ukraine. How do you handle all the information, especially in the public sector? And I think also to look into sectors like, how do you work with the public cloud solutions? So I think there's many, from a Swedish perspective, also those kind of sectors, especially that we find very interesting to look into and see if we can support more with.
Yeah, if I might just commend, I guess, Ukraine on the amazing work they are doing on engaging with their citizens, the government, because Ukraine is in times of war, and we as Moldovans have just learned to do something that Ukrainians have been doing. We've pretty much copied your DIA, and doing our own version. And when I say copied, we have learned because Ukraine has managed to develop and improve and use and still provide services through something as, this is part of the digital, I guess, infrastructure and digital services, access to services through digital platforms for the citizens. And that is amazing. I know in Moldova, they just had a mayor's conference, and we had mayors coming from Ukrainian cities sharing about their work during times of war and the resilience of both the people in the cities, but also of the city administrations to still keep it together, to keep communities together, to keep services, providing services, to still have kids in schools when there are sirens going off every so often. It's fascinating, and I want to commend Ukraine for that, for sure.
Yeah, I guess the one that I'd point out is perhaps a little unfortunate, but it's actually the military-industrial complexes. I think what the Ukraine war has shown pretty much every European country is that our military-industrial capacity has been largely hollowed out over the last couple of decades. And that works both ways. All of us are scrambling now, not only because of Ukraine, but of course for even larger global political reasons to build up indigenous military capacity. But I think it's also important for Ukraine. I think there are a lot of conversations about that. You know, Ukraine will need its own indigenous military capacity. I mean, we don't know how this conflict ends, but I mean, there are many ends that require Ukraine to be constantly vigilant for the future. And so I think there's been a lot of discussion about, building up military industry.
Yeah, just recently, EU has adopted a new military-industrial strategy, and it has a big portion of attention to Ukraine. EU plans to open innovation office in Kiev, so it obviously shows this interest and perspective of collaboration. So Ukraine is has big aspirations about this.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for this. For reminding us about military-industrial complex, which is the basis for winning the war. Okay, so we have like 10 minutes left. Probably we can take some questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Has there been any thought given by your agencies as well as those in Ukraine tasked with the redevelopment of the country to consider leveraging the global south, particularly emerging economies like India, as partners in the redevelopment, particularly with regards to manpower or person power for actual workforce, as well as the capital investments? And could you leverage your investments, particularly the British fund and the Swedish fund, to countries in the developing world to invest their resources into rebuilding Ukraine as a kind of a symbiotic ecosystem?
Do you want to start?
I'll go first. No, but it's a great idea. No, we haven't thought about it, but I mean, there was an allusion made right at the beginning to the demographic challenges presented by economic reconstruction, which is, I mean, Ukraine is facing a severe demographic issue. I mean, both losses on the battlefield, but also losses to emigration. So the idea of, yes, partnering with the global south or with India in order to address that demographic, I mean, that's a Ukrainian issue, but actually I haven't heard that, but it makes a great deal of sense.
I agree. I can't say that we have thought about it either. But it's an interesting perspective to bring. So maybe something for us to bring forward and to bring back.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of actual conversations being had, but I was just watching recently an interview with some very prominent, somebody from Horizon Capital actually, from Moldova, and they were talking about Moldovan development and also a little bit about reconstruction of Ukraine and how we all focus on foreign direct investments, but how that is so much long-term, exactly your points as well. And they were saying something very interesting, and it just connected when you asked the questions. They were saying something very interesting. They said it's very hard to bring foreign direct investments to a country like Moldova, right? Because it's small. But one of the things that we're not really necessarily paying too much attention is about bringing in foreign students. And that made me think, because that's also, to some degree, the equivalent of foreign direct investments that's immediately accessible. It's money that stays in the country. It doesn't work exactly the same way, but we actually have a massive, proportionally to the size of our education system, a massive number of Indian students studying in medical school, in our national medical school in Moldova. And if we could find ways of leveraging that and maybe connecting to the entire education system, maybe gearing up or adjusting our education system, both higher education, but also I think vocational, because I think it connects to the skills development. You know, Moldova is going to, if we are going to support Ukraine's rebuilding, recovery in a certain way, there may be need for a set of skills that we're not necessarily paying attention to as part of our education system. So if we could rethink that portion of our economy in a way, I think there could be opportunities to connect, and why not connect through that side of the human capital of things. I know we're in Moldova, we are thinking about providing our education processes, let's put it that way, as a platform for upskilling, both for Moldovans but also for Ukrainians, in terms of what will be necessary for their recovery. But why not expand that? But I have definitely not heard any conversations being had about actually leveraging the Global South.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you. There was one question. Yes, please.
Hello. I'm a consulting researcher with human rights related civil society in Ukraine. I just came back a couple weeks ago. But I wanted to ask, is there an international economic lens when approaching the issue of the occupied territories, including Crimea? And then to the same question, is there like an international economic lens or implication to the potential of reintegrating those territories back into Ukraine and the occupied populations? I'm also not an economist, so I apologize.
Yeah, I'm
that's a bad question.
not exactly sure. I mean, what you mean. I mean, there are economic implications to the integration of Crimea and other areas. I mean, energy security being principal amongst them. So it's an unfortunate truth that both fossil fuel power and also renewable power sources are principally located in, at the moment, the either occupied areas or, are pertinent to them. So certainly the economic future of Ukraine takes different paths, whether that is reclaimed as controlled by the Ukrainian economy or not. But I'm not so sure beyond that an economic lens is being used that much to them.
No, and we had investments in that part of Ukraine that we did in the energy sector before the war. So, to very much to your point, and it's important geography, and those assets, they are no longer in use, unfortunately. So, that's also kind of the consequence that you see. So, I think it's extremely important, to look at the whole country and the productivity of the country and the access to energy. From our perspective, we are not applying any lens to those geographies at this point in time. We do have investments, as I said, but we don't do any more investments in those geographies right now. But we focus on the other parts of Ukraine. I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
No, this is all a valuable learning experience. Yeah. So.
I can answer your question if you want to, as a representative of Ukraine. I was born in Donbass and Donetsk, so I know this region pretty well, and it has a lot of heavy industry there, like main industries was actually placed there. But unfortunately, when it was occupied by Russia, what they did, they cut those plants for just metal parts and brought all of that to Russia. So in fact, like a lot of assets were just destroyed, or they haven't been functioning for 10 years. And to make them work, you need to, keep the maintenance, etc. So now Ukrainian government considers reintegration not that much under economic lenses, but more like demographic, because it was heavily influenced by Russia. There is like whole generation of kids who grew up in pro-Russian schools. So they have a bit different perspective on what is happening and etc. So we're questioning what is going to happen if we reintegrate those territories and those people become, well, they're still Ukrainian citizens, but they start voting again. And this is what we were fighting against in Revolution of Dignity. So like it's very controversial topic and it's very difficult to answer. And currently at this stage, 10 years later, after we lost that part of our economy, it's not that, I wouldn't say it's not that important, but it's not the crucial point of view on this issue.
So you ultimately got the right answer.
Yeah.
But if I may add, in Moldova we have our breakaway region as well, and that region is an area of about 400,000 people. So not that much, but it used to be the most industrialized area. I guess that's how the Soviet legacy worked. You know, there was a logic to the madness, I guess. But once Moldova started its efforts of getting closer to the EU, we started putting together different types of agreements, and the DCFTA, which is the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement with the EU, when that was signed, what that basically allowed is exports with preferential treatment or for some special goods, exports to the EU. And initially, it was just kind of there for those for that area. It was just they were just seeing it as an existence. But they have quickly learned that the EU pays better money than Russia does. They pay on time, and they basically pay cash. So the way that Moldova has approached this economic element of things is that we allowed companies that are operating on that area to export to the EU as part of Republic of Moldova if they registered with the Moldovan authorities. When they did that, they were becoming, well, subject to all the legislation, and they were supposed to pay taxes, they were supposed to treat their employees properly and show all that in the books. I know it's not ideal, I know it's not yet there, but I can tell you that when now the unrecognized so-called Transnistrian authorities have heard that Moldova is working towards European integration, it was them who reached out to Chisinau and asked to be a part of this process, because they understood that there is value to that. And maybe Ukraine can use that element of European integration and the benefits, the economic benefits, because the EU will come with a lot of structural funds, with a lot of investment in terms of infrastructure and development of the country. And that could be leveraged in a way where you will try and attract your population back into the country. We've been saying for a long time, you know, make Moldova proper, more economically attractive, and they will come. It's been taking about 30 years, but we're still working on it, but we could try.
Some lessons to learn from Moldova as well. Okay, we're running out of time, so maybe just closing remarks, couple of things that you would like to stress before we wrap up.
I think it was a very rich discussion, but I guess maybe going back to where you started, I think the human capital perspective is extremely important to keep, and that is really the fundamental part, and that whatever we do, we need to keep that at the forefront. And then the numbers on the destruction and the amounts to be reinvested on infrastructure is almost not possible to grasp. There's a lot of zeros in those numbers, and to really find the right path on that will be, it's important, but we need to both short-term and long-term focus in doing that.
I want to actually say exactly the same thing. I fully agree. Human capital, human resources, the people, nothing happens without the people. So making sure that rebuild or build back better, whichever way Ukraine chooses to go, definitely puts its citizens at front and center, and make sure that you know they follow what is the will of the people.
I'll pick up that last statement, which is, I mean, hard choices will have to be made, and what's very important is, you know, that ultimately it's the voice of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people that should dictate those hard choices.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, dear speakers.
Thank you.